This is Puzzle Problem Mess. Conversations about the media economy and how to think clearly when things get messy. The thrust of this episode is that media companies often do see disruption coming ahead of time. Yet the struggle seems to be in orienting themselves to what that disruption means, deciding what course of action to take, and then doing it together in a quick enough time. When media companies can't manage this and they lose the initiative, it's often actually not because they lack strategy. More often, it's because their culture can't move at the tempo of the change happening around them. There's a concept that describes this problem uncannily well. It's the OODA loop. Once you understand it, you start to see it everywhere in the media economy. The concept of the OODA loop was developed by military strategist and US Air Force Colonel John Boyd. And for this episode, I've been extremely fortunate to be able to speak with Chet Richards, who was a longtime associate of John Boyd. But before we get to Chet, you need to hear a bit more about the OODA loop concept. Jocko Willink, a retired United States Navy officer who served in the Navy SEALs and is a former member of SEAL Team 3, has explained it well on his podcast. Here's Jocko.
Conflict can be seen as time-competitive observation, orientation, decision, action cycles. Each party to a conflict begins by observing. He observes himself, his physical surroundings, and his enemy. On the basis of his observation, he orients. That is to say, he makes a mental image or snapshot of his situation. On the basis of this orientation, he makes a decision. He puts the decision into effect, i.e., he acts. Then, because he assumes his action has changed the situation, he observes again and starts the process anew. His actions follow a cycle, sometimes called the Boyd cycle or OODA loop. And OODA is OODA, and that's observe, orient, decide, and act. If one side in a conflict can consistently go through the Boyd cycle faster than the other, it gains a tremendous advantage. By the time the slower side acts, the faster side is doing something different from what he observed, and his action is inappropriate. With each cycle, the slower party's action is inappropriate by a larger time margin. Even though he desperately strives to do something that will work, each action is less useful than its predecessor. He falls further and further behind. Ultimately, he ceases to be effective.
That was Jocko Willink. Now, the obvious question here is, what's this got to do with business? And more obviously, the business of media. Well, the link between the OODA loop and business is that the great disruptive companies of our times, for example, Toyota in the 80s, Apple for the 20 years from 2000, and Elon Musk's companies today, can all be understood through OODA-like principles. They're faster at sensing consumer, market, or technology opportunities. They have a very strong external orientation. They have shorter learning cycles. They tend towards decentralized action. And above all else, they set the agenda for the companies in their category. In media, arguably Netflix and YouTube can be seen in a similar light, leveraging OODA-like principles to force whole segments of the media economy onto the back foot, forcing them into reactive actions. Now, in this episode, I don't really spend any time on the OODA loop itself. I'm more interested in what it takes for media companies to develop these OODA-like traits, and that's where Chet comes in. Chet's book, Certain to Win, is a perspective-changing book. Chet and I focus on two topics, time and orientation. Time, because as you heard and will hear, time is a critical strategic and competitive instrument, and orientation because orientation is the engine room of the OODA concept. A company's ability to constantly orient itself amid the consumer and market forces swirling around it affects its ability to decide and act effectively. Here's Chet Richards. Chet Richards, thank you very much for joining the podcast today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Dan.
Why don't we start with the notion of time and time as a principal strategic device? Because this is something that you've written extensively about, and I think it's very, very relevant and familiar to people in media today.
It's a very interesting concept. Boyd's whole idea of operating inside the OODA loop is you do things to the other side and you exploit those things before the other side mentally can wrap their head around it. Not before the other side can respond necessarily, before they can even understand it. So you use time itself and manipulating time and making things happen when the other side doesn't expect, or in places that he may expect it, but at times they don't expect. It takes them time to figure out what it is that you did. And in that gap of time, you have the opportunity to act. And when they see you act, they've got to try to reorient themselves to what you're doing now. But in the meantime, you can do something else. So this game can be played and has been played again in the military over and over and over again. There have been attacks that succeeded because they broke down. When they broke down, the other side got confused, couldn't figure out what was happening. And while that was going on, one very low-level person saw an opportunity and seized it and did something that broke the whole line open. Very, very common in the military where your formal plan breaks down. But people, by being able to understand this before the other side does and being able to use the initiative, is a wonderful word, to exploit this before the other side can figure it out. So Boyd got to thinking, these attacks succeeded because they broke down. But they succeeded because when they broke down, one side was able to figure out what was going on and exploit it before the other side did. And so that's fundamental of the military use of time. And Boyd says, select the initiative that is the least expected. Interesting. That's an interesting point there, because most military training and virtually all models would select the response that they predict will be the most effective. Boyd is saying don't do that. Why? Well, if your model says this is probably the most effective thing to do, probably the other side can figure that out too. If it's the one that's least expected, now the enemy's got to stop and figure out what's going on. And while he's trying to figure out what's going on, confusion and ambiguity builds up. You have the opportunity to do something, and so on and so on. That's what this notion of seizing the initiative, of operating inside the OODA loop does in the military. Now, virtually none of that applies to business. You're not trying to generate uncertainty, confusion, panic, and chaos. As a general rule, trying to come up with products and services that customers will actually want to buy at a high enough price to make it worth your while to do it. What's the purpose of time? How does time affect business competition? Well, the first thing you might think is, well, the first mover advantage. The first person out with a product or service has an advantage. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, there's very, very little data to support that. Okay, sometimes the first thing out is a big flop or doesn't work very well. Somebody who is watching from the sidelines can see it and come out with a better example later. And so you say, well, but yeah, there's still got to be something to do with time. Compared to the military, business competition, it looks to us with the military background, it just moves in hideous slow motion. It takes months, years to do anything. And we're thinking in terms of engagements and battles and things where fractions of a second may be decisive. Rounds start coming in, what do? You don't have time to hold a meeting and hold a council of war and vote. You got to go with what you have immediately. So much of military training is coming up with that set of responses, of actions, what Boyd called your implicit repertoire, that you can implement immediately as a group with minimum friction in order to accomplish the purpose of what you're trying to exploit an opportunity, dodge enemy fire, whatever it is. But very, very little in business obeys that model. Typically, it probably make too much difference whether we bring out our new product in 6 months or 8 months or a year. What really makes a difference is that when it comes out, how does it stack up to what the competition is offering? The customer is going to look at our stuff, is going to look at the competition stuff, is going to look at the option of buying nothing at all, keeping what he's got, and going to make a decision. So much of what I advise business organizations is basically profound knowledge is outside your company. It's point number one. Everything else follows from that. Because it doesn't make any difference what goes on inside the company if the customer doesn't buy your product or service. It's 100% waste at that point.
A big focus of Chet's thinking is around the military concept of initiative. In military terms, initiative can be understood as the ability to shape the course of events so that the opponent is forced to respond to your moves on your timing and under conditions that favor you. In a business setting, initiative is the ability of a company to shape the market, the customer expectation, or the competitive space, so that others are responding to its movement rather than it merely reacting to theirs. What I find striking about Chet's writing on this topic is that initiative is not so much a product of strategy, rather, it's a product of culture. He writes that initiative is a product of orientation, time, and, crucially, organisational trust. Here's Chet. You've written extensively and catalogued a number of examples where the use of time and the maintenance or the recovery of initiative comes down to culture, not capacity or not capability. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Initiative is absolutely critical. It allows you to generate this uncertainty, confusion, and chaos and exploit it while the opportunity is still there. It allows you to operate on the other side. It's just a wonderful, wonderful tool in war-type conflicts. And by that, I mean not just war, but anything where you have A versus B. And it's zero sum. Only one side can come away. Anything one side wins, the other side loses. That's conflict. Business is conflict in a very real sense, in that if, for example, if the customer buys my product, he's not spending that money buying your product. So I'm stealing at least that part of your business away. So it has that zero sum element to it. What's different, of course, is that you can do anything that you want to your competitor, but if the customer buys his product or service anyway, it's a completely different sort of thing. So when you're thinking this through, and I talked with John actually a lot about this from about 1987, 88, when I first started doing this, until he started really winding down in 96. And of course, he died in March 97. And what we figured was the real thing that makes initiative work, why it can have this effect that it has, is, and he borrowed from Lawrence of Arabia on this, somehow you got inside the other guy's mind. And he said, think about let's go back to the military, for example. The other side has a command post. He's got this map laid out on the ground. There's little toy tanks, little toy artillery, and he's moving stuff around on it and all of that. And they're making decisions about where they're going to. Let's suppose that you somehow or another were a fly on that wall, or a GoPro camera on that wall, undetected. And you're watching all this going on. You're watching what he's doing. You'd have no problems. You shouldn't have. There are cases where the other side got their opponent's battle plans and still managed to screw it up. McClellan and Antietam in the U.S. Civil War being a classic case of that. But the basic idea is if you could be sitting watching him make his decisions, you'd have a huge advantage. Well, you may not be able to do that, but by understanding the enemy really, really well, you can have a lot of the same effects. And that is finally the answer to your question. The way that you generate initiative in any organization, business or otherwise, and it follows all down to this operating inside the OODA stuff, is what he called a similar implicit orientation. And all that means is that basically everybody in your organization, to some extent or another, is singing from the same sheet of music. They're singing different notes, they're singing in harmony, but they all have a common general understanding of what's going on outside the company in particular, and maybe to a lesser extent what's going on inside. But this is really for understanding what's going on outside. They understand where the company is in trouble. They understand where it's got opportunities. And that level of understanding about your customer is what we're driving at. The more you understand the outside world, the more you'll be able to take the initiative, operate inside your customer's loop.
If you're on the wrong side of initiative, things can quickly go from bad to worse. Let's listen to another passage from Jocko Willink.
The Boyd theory defines what is meant by the word maneuver in the term maneuver warfare. Maneuver means Boyd cycling. Boyd cycling the enemy, being consistently faster through however many OODA loops it takes until the enemy loses its cohesion, until he can no longer fight as an effective, organized force. Sometimes a Boyd cycled enemy panics or becomes passive. This is an ideal outcome for the victor because a panicked passive enemy can be annihilated or captured at the lowest cost in friendly casualties. At other times, the outmaneuvered enemy may continue to fight as individuals or small units, but because he can no longer act effectively as a force, he is comparatively easy to destroy.
Now, the passage from Jocko is clearly grounded in a military context and language, to be sure, but within the media industries, there's a more benign but nonetheless pernicious version of this at play. And that is that when a media organization loses the initiative, it becomes reactive. It spends its energy responding to someone else's tempo. And for a company that's losing the initiative, you might well point to a failure of strategy, capacity, or capability. But Chet's work is clear. It's more likely a failure of culture. Chet points to 5 organizational and cultural traits that together create the conditions for a company to seize and maintain initiative. The first one is mutual trust and unity. The second one is what Chet refers to as fingertip feeling or intuitive feel. The third one is that there is a main effort or a focal point for activity. The fourth one, Chet talks about a mission type command. And fifth is a state of mental agility. Of note, this last one, Chet sees as the output of 1 to 4. If you have those, you produce organizational agility. Here's Chet on the cultural ingredients for initiative. You've written in your book extensively in one of the chapters that cultural traits like mutual trust, the ability to
Boyd listed
cope with
Boyd
chaos.
listed 5 of them.
Yeah,
Right. Boyd
exactly.
listed 5 of them, as you know. And he used the German words because it was the Germans that first codified this Einheit. Ein in German means one. Height roughly translates as NESS in English. So oneness, unity. It's a German word for a unit, a military unit, for example. But it has the connotation here of mutual trust, is how Boyd typically translated it. It's Einheit is sort of the boundary around us. It separates us from them. People you have Einheit with is your group. And what trust does, of course, is it greatly speeds things up. You don't have to do a lot of checking, a lot of hedging. If somebody says something, you believe them. If somebody says they're going to do something, you believe that they're going to do it. And if they can't do it, they'll either die in the attempt, or as soon as it becomes clear that they can't do it, they'll communicate with you so that your picture, your orientation matches their orientation. You have a common orientation about what's really going on in the world. So it's almost impossible to overstate the role of trust. If you go back and look at Sun Tzu again, chapter 1 of Sun Tzu, the very second verse, he lists these things on these 5. He has the same list in 3 different places. And basically, the very first one is trust. He calls it the way, which side has the way. But if you look at the commentators down there explaining what the way is, we would translate it as Einheit, mutual trust. Fundamental. Without it, don't even bother to go on. You'll never get anything done. People will spend all their time playing politics and arguing and trying to upstage each other and all that, which is fine if you have no competition. But once the level of competition heats up and you've got to turn out products and services that people actually want, that's when the need for mutual trust becomes fundamental. All right, that's the first one. And given that we all trust each other, and the second thing is, and oddly enough, it goes along with the first, and that's Fingerspitzengefühl. Fingerspitzengefühl, fingertip feeling in German, but it literally means that intuitive sense to where everybody is so good at what they do that most of the time they don't have to stop and think about it. They can handle unexpected things in a smooth way. You see them, and as they're doing it, your mental models are making a prediction, and based on that prediction, then you do something. And it has to be about that quick. The human brain is capable of operating incredibly quickly. That's what Boyd called Fingerspitzengefühl. So you have this perception of the outside world, your mental models are making predictions, and your Fingerspitzengefühl knows what to do the vast majority of the time. Now, everybody in the organization has to have Fingerspitzengefühl for what it is they're doing. The president all the way down to the people working on the factory floor and everybody in between. And what that does is that builds pride. That builds the basis for mutual trust. I'm really good at what I do. You're really good at what you do. And that builds a basis for self-respect, which is the basis for mutual trust. Cannot be overstated enough, just like mutual trust. All right. Now, given that we're all really good at what we do and we all trust each other, what are we going to do? Well, that's where the next one comes in. Schwerpunkt. Schwerpunkt, hard point, literally, or difficult point. Clausewitz most translations of Clausewitz, I don't believe Clausewitz spoke any English. I don't think there's any indication that he did. And even if he did, he wrote in German. It's usually translated as, when I say center of gravity. But how Boyd used it and how maneuver warfare now uses it today is stop back and think of what it is you're trying to do. What are you trying to accomplish? What is it that when you accomplish it, you'll feel like you've actually done something. In that sense, it's kind of hard to explain, but in the military, it's fairly easy. You have an operation, it doesn't have to be where most of the force is. The next one is say, well, how do you make the Schwerpunkt thing work? You want lots of intelligence and creativity working together. There's that Einheit again, in a common very quickly to solve the customer's problems. And that's where Auftragstaktik comes in. Literally in German, an Auftrag is a contract, but the connotation of it is that senior people set what is to be done and they devolve everything else down into the organization while keeping their Fingerspitzengefühl, their fingers on the pulse of what's happening in the organization. In other words, it's not just enough to call people in and say, okay, we got a big emergency, I want you to do this, this, and this, and then go back to sleep. Some of the stuff's going to work, some of it's not. You've got to give the mission, and mission is how it's typically translated into English. Give the mission to your team, but also be able to sense to your Fingerspitzengefühl how your team is doing, how your team is on. So you got one set of fingers on the team, another set of fingers figuring what's going on out in the outside world. And through your Fingerspitzengefühl, you bring it all together. Very difficult, but that's why CEOs are in the big bucks. So there's the four things that it's in Einheit, mutual trust, Fingerspitzengefühl, being really good at what you're doing throughout the organization. Schwerpunkt, being able to say, okay, what out of all this in combination is really, really the important thing that we're trying to, and it can be more than one in business with the caveat that as long as they don't trade off.
Listening to Chet, we end up some distance from a sterile reading of the OODA loop as a decision-making framework. We end up instead in the realm of culture and ambition. The implication is that a media company doesn't need to be the biggest player in the market to recover initiative, but it does need to work relentlessly at external orientation up and down the organization. And it needs a culture of mutual trust, intuitive feel, a clear mission, and empowered leadership right down the organization. Here's Chet to wrap it up.
The final piece of it now is to be able to do all of this stuff. And here's time coming back in what Boyd called in the terms of a mental agility, Behendigkeit. In other words, to be able to do all this good stuff while there's still an opportunity to do it. So we say there is no first mover advantage, but if the first mover comes out, learns from it, and comes out with the second one while you're still trying to react to his first one, now you may have a problem. So it's not so much the first mover experience, it's the first learner experience. And with the OODA loop, the observe, then orient, then decide, that is a model of learning. And in businesses, learning is really what it's all about. You have the implicit guidance and control links going out, and that's very important in a military type conflicts. But in business, it's much more subtle. The implicit guidance and control it's sort of invisible. It's that Auftragstaktik inside the company. What's really important is that the company constantly is learning at a fast enough rate so that it has a better picture of what's going on in the external. It's making their sort of corporate common implicit orientation, that orientation, which is a mental model, is making better predictions of what's going to happen than your competitors or even your customers for that matter. If you're the one creating the future, it's much easier to predict.
Thank you so much. This has been a very rich conversation on the topic of initiative and culture as it relates to time. So thank you very much, Chet.
Thanks, Dan. We'll talk to you later.
That was Chet Richards with a challenge that may be uncomfortable for media companies. The problem isn't always whether change can be seen. The harder problem is whether an organization can orient, decide, and act quickly enough together to meet the change. Once internal tempo falls behind external tempo, the company becomes reactive. Initiative can be recovered, but not by strategy alone. It requires culture, trust, feel, focus, mission, and learning speed. Thanks for listening. I'm Dan Fay. Original music by Lee Rosevere and SoCal. And if you like this episode, please share with a friend or colleague.